Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we really try to get under the hood of complex ideas, drawing from philosophy, psychology, different sources, really, to see what hidden insights we can uncover.
Right, today we are definitely diving deep. We're looking at something fundamental, the very structure of our conscience, our sense of moral authority, and our guides, well, they're intellectual heavyweights, Immanuel Kant and Sigmund Freud.
Two figures you wouldn't necessarily expect to see side by side, perhaps. Their views on the self seem so different.
On the surface, yes. Kant, all about rationality and duty. Freud, diving into the unconscious, desires, conflicts. Yet they connect in some really surprising ways.
And we're starting with a real bombshell statement, actually from Freud himself. He looked at Kant's highest moral principle, the categorical imperative.
You know, the idea that you should only act in ways you could rationally want everyone else to act. Universalizability.
Exactly that. And Freud said this principle is the direct heir of the Oedipus complex.
Which is just, wow. Talk about a provocative claim. It immediately tries to ground Kant's abstract rational law in something deeply primal, doesn't it?
Totally. It's linking high philosophy to infantile feelings, love, hate, fear, wanting to be the parent.
Right. And this idea, it's actually spurred a lot of work, especially in recent philosophy. People have tried using Freud's model of the mind, the id, ego, superego structure, to give a kind of natural developmental story for Kantian morality.
They see parallel structural similarities in how both systems describe inner struggle, right? That feeling of being pulled in different directions.
Precisely. The demanding nature of morality in both views looks quite similar on the surface.
But that's where our mission for today really kicks in. We want to argue that this standard comparison, the one focusing on, let's say, the difficulty of morality, actually misses something crucial.
Yeah, there's a detail in Freud's later work, his final metapsychology, that often gets glossed over. And it's not just a minor point. We think it fundamentally changes how we should understand internalized authority.
It challenges our whole everyday picture of how moral ideals work inside us.
That's the goal. We want to move beyond just talking about inner conflict, which Kant maps out very clearly, and reveal what Freud suggests is an internormative contradiction.
Okay, conflict versus contradiction. That sounds like a key shift. Conflict is like a tug of war between two sides.
Right, two different forces pulling, like reason versus desire in Kant.
A contradiction, that's like the rope itself is tied in a knot or pulling in opposite directions from the same point.
Exactly. It's a logical impossibility baked into the authority itself. And that, we argue, makes the whole picture of the moral self much more unstable, much more challenging for achieving, say, autonomy.
Okay, this sounds fascinating, but maybe a bit abstract still.
Yeah.
Let's lay the groundwork first. We need to get clear on the standard accounts, starting with Freud's model of the psyche. Just the basics for context.
Sure. So Freud's structural model divides the mind, functionally speaking, into three agencies. First up, the id.
The primal core.
That's it. Oldest part, totally unconscious, pure psychic energy. Its only goal is discharge, release of tension. It operates entirely on the pleasure principle.
Instant gratification, consequences, reality, none of that matters to the id.
Not a bit. And its way of thinking, its primary process, is crucial. Things like condensation, blending ideas, displacement, shifting, feelings, symbolization. It's dream logic, basically.
Makes sense why dreams are so bizarre then.
Completely. And importantly for our discussion later, the id is utterly indifferent to external reality, to time, and crucially, to logical laws. There's no negation. A wish feels the same as doing the thing.
And this irrational core, it sticks around. We don't just outgrow it.
Nope, it persists throughout life. Rationality gets layered on top, but the id is always there.
Okay, that inherent irrationality, I'm already seeing how that might cause problems for a nice, clean moral system later on. So after the id
comes the ego. It develops out of the id, basically through contact with the outside world, through perception and consciousness.
The negotiator, the one trying to manage things.
Exactly. The ego is about adaptation. It operates under the reality principle. It uses conscious logical thought, what Freud called secondary process.
So the ego does care about logic, time, consequences. It knows the difference between thinking about stealing the cookie and actually doing it.
Yes. The reality principle means acknowledging what's true, even if it's unpleasant. The ego tries to be rational, to mediate between the id's demands and the constraints of the real world.
Okay, id, ego, and then the big one for morality, the superego. This is the internal judge, right? How does the standard story say it comes about?
The standard count ties it directly to resolving the Oedipus complex. The young child, caught in that intense triangle of love, desire, jealousy, and fear towards the parents.
The whole drama.
Right. It creates huge anxiety, fear of punishment, castration anxiety classically. The way out, the resolution, involves internalizing those parental figures, especially the ones seen as powerful and prohibitive, often the father figure. This is identification.
So instead of fighting or possessing the parent externally, you take their authority inside. Like, if you can't beat them, join them, but internally.
Kind of, yes. You internalize their characteristics, their rules, their power. This sets up the superego within the ego. And it has two faces, typically.
Okay.
First, there's the ego ideal. This is the positive side. It's the idealized image of the parent, the figure the ego now strives to become. It holds the promise of love, completeness, the good stuff.
Good like daddy.
Sort of, yeah. Be like this admirable, powerful figure. But then there's the second face.
The critical.
Exactly. The superego proper. This is the critical agency, the conscience, in a more prohibitive sense. It constantly measures the gap, the tension between what the ego is and what the ego ideal says it ought to be.
And that gap, that feeling of falling short, that's guilt.
That's guilt or moral anxiety, the feeling of I'm not good enough, measured against that internal standard.
And this is where people usually draw the line straight to Kant, isn't it? The superego sounds like an internal commander, just like Kant's categorical imperative, always demanding.
Precisely. Freud himself made the comparison explicit. He said, just like the child had to obey the parents, the ego now has to submit to the categorical imperative of its superego.
So in the standard view, both systems feature a powerful internal voice demanding obedience to a high, difficult standard. Seems like a neat parallel.
It does. It makes the superego look like a coherent, if strict, internal lawgiver.
Okay, let's switch gears now to Kant. When philosophers talk about Kantian ethics, what's the central feature of our moral experience for him?
It's fundamentally about inner conflict. The very phrase, I ought, reveals a split within the self.
A division? How so?
Because the self is, on the one hand, the rational author of the moral law, the part that recognizes and gives the law through reason, autonomy. But on the other hand, the self is also the imperfect, sensible addressee of that law, the part that doesn't always want to follow it.
Because we're human, right? We're not just pure reason. We have desires, inclinations, self-interest.
Exactly. We're subject to what Kant called two heterogeneous sources of motivation. There's rational duty, what reason tells us is right, and then there are our natural inclinations, driven by self-love or desire for happiness. And these two don't automatically line up.
So the moral law has to feel like a command, a constraint, an imperative.
Precisely. If we were perfectly rational beings, holy wills, as Kant puts it, the law would just describe how we act. But because we're conflicted, it has to command us. It says, you must, against the pull of our desires.
And virtue, for Kant, isn't about reaching some state of perfect peace where the conflict disappears.
No, not in this life. Virtue is a moral disposition in conflict. The moral law actually commands something incredibly high. Holiness, perfection, a state where inclination perfectly aligns with duty.
But he admits it's impossible for us.
As finite, sensible creatures, yes, holiness is unattainable. So virtue lies in the striving, the constant struggle against inclination to follow the law. The conflict itself is where human morality happens. It's a constant, though unattainable goal.
Okay, so Kant gives us a coherent, if incredibly demanding, ideal, and the moral life is the struggle towards it. The conflict is between reason and inclination.
Right, a clear conflict between two distinct parts or motivations.
And in the standard Freudian parallel, it looks similar. The ego striving against the superego's demands may be pulled by the id's desires too. Conflict all around.
It seems to map quite well.
But this is where you say the standard comparison misses the crucial Freudian twist. We need to move from just conflict to contradiction.
Exactly. We need to unpack this concept Freud called the Doppelangesicht, the double aspect of the superego. This is where things get really interesting and, frankly, unsettling.
Okay, double aspect. What does that mean? It's not just the ego ideal and the critical agency.
It includes those, but it adds a layer. Freud notes that the superego isn't just formed by identifying with the parent, taking in the ideal, be like father.
Which would be the positive part, the ought.
Right. Freud says it's also formed through an energetic reaction formation against the original object choices, against those intense Oedipal desires. It's not just absorbing the ideal, it's actively pushing against the desire to, say, possess the mother and displace the father.
Okay, a reaction formation, like an internal no to those early wishes.
Precisely. And that no, that rejection of the original wish to be the authority or have what the authority has, introduces the second, darker command within the superego.
So it's not just, you ought to be like this, like your father, the ideal.
It's also simultaneously, you may not be like this, like your father. Some things, ultimate authority, maybe success itself in some contexts, remain the father's prerogative, off limits to you.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying the same internal authority figure is telling me both to be like the ideal and not to be like the ideal?
That's the bombshell.
Yes.
The superego issues contradictory normative demands. Be like me, and don't you dare be like me, rolled into one.
That's impossible. That's not just a high bar like Kant's holiness, which is unreachable. This sounds like a command structure that logically cancels itself out. Strive for this goal, and also you are forbidden from striving for this goal.
It is a contradiction. And that's the radical Freudian insight that goes beyond simple conflict. It suggests the very source of our moral compass is, at its root, ambivalent and paradoxical.
My head is spinning a bit. How can that even function? If the law is contradictory, how do you follow it? Doesn't this just paralyze you or make guilt inevitable no matter what you do?
Well, it certainly complicates things. It suggests that guilt isn't just about falling short. Guilt can arise from failing to meet the ideals. You ought to. That's insubordination. But it can also arise from succeeding, from getting too close to the ideal. You may not. That's also insubordination, seen as usurpation.
So trying hard might make you feel guilty for not succeeding, but succeeding might also make you feel guilty for having the audacity to succeed.
That's the bind. The fear of failure meets the fear of success, both stemming from the same contradictory source.
Wow. Okay. This feels intuitively resonant with certain kinds of anxiety, maybe, but it seems so. Irrational. Why would our moral structure be built on a contradiction? Does Freud offer reasons why this makes sense within his system?
He does. There are several lines of thought in Freud that support this seemingly bizarre idea of the double aspect.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the first?
Ambivalence. Remember where the superego comes from, the Oedipus complex. And that whole situation is drenched in emotional ambivalence.
Love and hate for the same person.
Exactly. Intense love, admiration, wanting to be like the parent, alongside intense jealousy, hatred, fear. It's a mix. When the child internalizes that relationship to form the superego, they internalize the whole ambivalent dynamic.
So the contradictory commands just reflect the contradictory feelings.
Precisely. You ought to be like this reflects the love and admiration. You may not be like this reflects the fear, hatred, and the sense of the parent's prohibitive power. The commands mirror the feelings.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of psychological sense. The structure reflects its emotional origins. What's the second support?
This one's quite surprising. It's the superego's connection to the id.
Wait, I thought the superego was the opposite of the id? The moral police versus the inner criminal?
That's the common view. But Freud explicitly says the superego reaches deep down into the id and can be cruel as only the id can be. It harnesses some of the id's primitive destructive energy.
It uses the id's power against the ego.
In a way, yes. It draws energy from those instinctual reservoirs. And think back to what we said about the id. It's totally indifferent to logic, right?
Right. No contradictions bother the id.
So, if the superego is partly fueled by and connected to this irrational, contradiction-ignoring id, maybe we shouldn't be surprised if its commands also aren't perfectly logical from the ego's point of view. Its voice might naturally be inconsistent.
Okay, so the irrationality isn't a bug, it's a feature inherited from the id.
That's a plausible reading within Freud's framework. And the third point, supporting the double aspect, relates more to everyday experience. It helps explain diffuse anxiety.
That vague sense of guilt or unease that doesn't seem attached to anything specific?
Exactly. As adults, our moral worries aren't always about concrete parental disapproval anymore. It's more abstract, self-worth, social standing. But sometimes we feel this free-floating guilt or anxiety. Why?
The double aspect gives an answer.
It suggests this anxiety comes from the inherent uncertainty the contradiction creates. Am I doing too little, failing the ought? Or am I doing too much, violating the may not? Am I striving properly, or am I being presumptuous just by trying? You're caught.
So you feel vaguely wrong because the internal rules make it impossible to be definitively right.
That's the idea. It captures that sense of being vaguely under judgment, even when you can't pinpoint the crime.
Okay, this paints a very different picture of conscience, but my rational side is still fighting it. Surely there are ways to resolve this apparent contradiction. Can't we interpret the may not differently?
Absolutely. The rational mind tries to smooth this out. There are common objections. The first one basically says, maybe the may not isn't about striving for the ideal, but about actually succeeding in displacing the parent.
Like, you can try to be like dad, but you can't actually take his place with mom or take over his company, maybe. It prohibits the final act of usurpation, not the effort.
That would make it more like Kant, again, strive for the impossible, but except you can't reach it. It maintains coherence.
But you're saying Freud wouldn't accept that interpretation.
Based on his own principles, it's difficult. Remember the logic of the unconscious, the primary process, which fuels the superego.
No difference between wish and deed.
Exactly. And no real negation. The superego condemns not just bad actions, but bad thoughts, forbidden wishes. From the unconscious perspective that the superego taps into, the very striving towards the ideal, the wish to occupy that authoritative position, is already tantamount to the forbidden act of usurpation.
Wow. So just wanting to be successful or autonomous is already unconsciously a crime.
It can be registered that way by this primitive part of the psychic structure. The conscious ego sees striving as good, but the superego, drawing on the id, might see the striving itself as the hubris, the forbidden act.
Okay, that torpedoes the first objection pretty effectively using Freud's own logic. What about another way to dissolve it? Can we maybe partition the commands?
How do you mean?
Like maybe the superego says, you ought to be successful like your father in your career, but you may not try to be the head of the family like your father. You separate out different aspects of the ideal.
So some parts are okay to emulate, others are off limits. That sounds rational.
Yeah, it makes the commands apply to different domains so they don't contradict.
The problem here, again, from a Freudian perspective, is condensation.
Ah, that primary process thing where different ideas get merged.
Right. Unconscious thought isn't great at making these fine distinctions. A single trait like achieving success, asserting independence, thinking for oneself, can unconsciously condense the entire authority figure.
So succeeding in my career might feel unconsciously like I'm trying to take Dad's entire place, even if consciously that makes no sense.
Exactly. Pursuing even a permitted aspect of the ideal might trigger the global prohibition because unconsciously, that part represents the whole forbidden position. The system isn't precise enough to partition cleanly.
Man, Freud really makes the unconscious a messy place.
He does. And the implication here is profound. It means resistance to our own moral goals, our own autonomy, doesn't just come from laziness or external obstacles. It can come from the moral authority itself.
The thing telling you to succeed is also secretly telling you not to. It generates its own resistance.
The command structure is inherently self-sabotaging, in a way.
Okay, so we have this stark contrast. Kant's coherent, conflicted self striving towards an impossible ideal versus Freud's contradictory self, bound by an authority that both commands and forbids the ideal. But you mentioned earlier there's still a surprising point of contact, right? Where Kant almost touches on this Freudian incoherence.
Yes, it's in his concept of Eigendunkel, which is usually translated as self-conceit.
Self-conceit. I usually think of that as just being arrogant or maybe fooling yourself about your motives.
That's the standard ethical reading, yes. Thinking your selfish act was really motivated by duty, for example, like wanting applause for charity.
Right. Standard self-deception.
But Kant also discusses it in a deeper, almost anthropological way. It's not just about deceiving yourself about why you did something, but deceiving yourself about what kind of being you are.
How so?
Well, Kant insists we are finite, sensible, divided creatures who need the constraint of duty. Anthropological self-conceit is the illusion, the delusion that we aren't like that we're somehow above the struggle.
The illusion that we're naturally good, spontaneously moral, like a holy will,
Right.
that we don't feel the conflict.
Precisely. It's the wish to deny our fundamental human condition of being conflicted and finite. Kant says we actually have a duty to know ourselves as these kinds of creatures. Self-conceit is the hubris of pretending we're already angelic.
Okay, I think I see where you're going. Pretending to be the Holy One. That sounds a bit like trying to occupy the position the Freudian superego prohibits, doesn't it?
It gets very close. Because think about the command, the moral law issues to us, these finite creatures. Be holy. Be perfect.
A command we know we can't fulfill.
Right. So, heard through the reality of our finitude, the command sounds almost paradoxical. You ought to be this holy, and you fundamentally cannot be this because you're human.
That does have a bit of a cruel ring to it, now that you put it that way. Strive for perfection, but don't you dare think you can actually achieve it, you mere human.
It has, as one commentator put it, a whiff of the cruelty of the superego. The striving is demanded, but the delusion that one could actually be holy, that one has overcome finitude, that is the ultimate moral failing, self-conceit, which the law must strike down.
So the moral law itself has to humiliate us in a sense, show us the gap.
Yes, Kant says, the law striking down self-conceit is a necessary step for true moral respect, Achtung, to emerge. Humiliation precedes reverence.
Okay, that's a fascinating parallel, but there's still a crucial difference, isn't there? Even if Kant's law sounds harsh, it's not strictly contradictory in the Freudian sense.
No, and this is a vital distinction we must maintain. It's about the modality of the blockage.
Modality, meaning?
Meaning the type of impossibility involved. For Kant, the conflict is between an ideal, be holy, and a condition, our finitude, that makes full attainment impossible in this life. The operative word is cannot. The system is logically coherent, even if the goal is infinitely deferred. He even postulates immortality to allow for eventual achievement.
Right. Logically possible, just practically unreachable here and now.
But for Freud, the problem is a normative contradiction. The ideal is at once prescribed, be like this, and proscribed, don't you dare. The operative word is may not. It's about permission, not capability. The authority itself is incoherent.
Cannot versus may not. That really crystallizes the difference. One is a limitation, the other is a paradoxical command.
Exactly. And it's this Freudian may not, this inherent contradiction, that gives us perhaps a richer lens for understanding certain kinds of psychological struggles that seem to go beyond just weakness of will or simple conflict.
Okay, let's bring this down to earth then. What are the practical implications? How does seeing the superego as contradictory help explain things we or people we know actually experience?
It sheds light on several patterns that are often puzzling. The big one is self-sabotage.
Ah, yes. Shooting yourself in the foot just when things are going well. We all know that one, or have seen it.
Right. You have a goal you consciously want. Maybe you even know you ought to achieve it. Finish the thesis, speak up at the meeting, commit to the relationship. But you find yourself doing everything but that. Procrastinating, picking fights, finding distractions.
The usual explanation is fear of failure, or maybe laziness, or just not wanting it enough.
Those can play a role. But the double aspect offers a deeper possibility. Maybe you're unconsciously obeying the prescription. Consciously, your ego says, I ought to do this, succeed, be autonomous. But succeeding means approaching the ideal, taking on authority.
Which violates the hidden you may not command.
Exactly. So by sabotaging yourself, you unconsciously obey the prohibition. You can see that assuming that successful authoritative position would be presumptuous. The conscious thought might be, I can't. But the unconscious driver is, I may not.
That flips the script. The failure isn't just weakness, it's a form of hidden obedience.
It can be. And this logic also makes sense of things like imposter syndrome.
Feeling like a fraud, even when you're successful. Convinced you don't deserve to be where you are.
Precisely. You've achieved the position, the degree, the recognition objectively. You've approached the ideal. The external world says yes. But the internal superego, with its proscriptive side, whispers, who do you think you are? You have no right to occupy this place. It's not yours.
The success itself feels like a transgression.
It does. And that leads directly to the third phenomenon, guilt in success. Why would someone feel anxious, depressed, or guilty after achieving something good, something they worked hard for?
From a rational Kantian perspective, achieving the good should bring satisfaction, maybe reverence.
Right. But if the superego is contradictory, then succeeding getting close to the ego ideal is itself a violation of the may not clause. You've dared to approximate the forbidden authority.
So you achieve the goal, and then the punishment kicks in. The guilt arrives after the success.
Yes. The success triggers the proscriptive aspect, leading to that baffling post-achievement anxiety or depression. It's the price for unconsciously perceived usurpation.
This really highlights how the resistance isn't just external. It's baked into the very structure commanding the goal.
The authority undermines itself.
So if this contradiction, this ambivalence, is structural, maybe even unavoidable, what does that mean for mental health, for psychological maturation? Can we ever overcome this? Or are we just doomed to self-sabotage?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What does the good enough psychic life look like if this contradiction is fundamental?
Many psychological or philosophical models aim for harmony, right? The goal is often seen as integrating the superego, making its commands rational, aligning them with the ego's values through conscious reflection, getting rid of the contradiction.
That's certainly a common ideal. The hope is that the mature ego can assess the superego's demands, endorse the reasonable ones, discard the irrational ones, and achieve a kind of coherent, wholehearted commitment to its values, rational integration.
But Freud seems skeptical about that kind of neat resolution.
He does. He often emphasizes how early experiences, especially the Oedipus complex, leave a lasting imprint. He talks about the superego retaining the character of the father complex. It remains partly separate, a memorial to the former weakness and dependence of the ego.
So it resists being fully tamed by reason. It keeps some of its primitive contradictory power.
That seems to be Freud's implication. If the superego is fundamentally rooted in that early ambivalence, trying to achieve perfect, unambivalent wholeheartedness might be not only impossible but actually a defensive fantasy.
A fantasy that denies the messy reality of our psychological structure.
Perhaps. Trying too hard to eliminate all internal contradiction might even fuel the pathology because it refuses to acknowledge the may not side, which then operates more powerfully from the shadows.
So if eliminating the contradiction isn't the goal, what is? How do we live with it healthily?
Maybe the goal isn't elimination, but negotiation. Coming to terms with the fact that our relationship with our own ideals and authorities is likely to remain, to some degree, ambivalent.
Accepting an ineradicable dimension of normative ambivalence, that sounds challenging.
It is. But maybe health here means the relationship between the ego and superego is merely tinged with this ambivalence, rather than being crippled or defined by it.
Like a good long-term relationship, there's love and admiration, but also occasional frustration or disagreement. The ambivalence is there, but it doesn't destroy the connection.
That's a great analogy. The ambivalence is managed, integrated, acknowledged, rather than denied. Pathologies like severe self-sabotage or imposter syndrome are perhaps exaggerations where the contradiction completely takes over, rather than just being a background hum.
So accepting that a little bit of anxiety about success or a slight hesitation in fully claiming authority might actually be normal, a sign that the internal system is working rather than a sign of failure.
It could be. It might mean acknowledging that the ideal of perfect, fearless, unambivalent autonomy is itself perhaps part of the problem, a denial of our complex psychic inheritance.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've journeyed from Kant's seemingly coherent picture of inner conflict reason versus inclination to Freud's much more tangled vision.
We saw how the standard comparison based on the demandingness of morality breaks down when we introduce Freud's idea of the superego's Doppelangesicht, its double aspect.
Which reveals not just conflict, but a deep structural normative contradiction. The internal authority commands us to be like the ideal and simultaneously forbids us from being like the ideal. Ought meets may not.
And this isn't just a theoretical quirk. It provides, we argued, a powerful explanation for real-world psychological phenomena like self-sabotage, imposter syndrome, and that strange guilt that can follow success.
It suggests that resistance to achieving our goals can stem from the very source that sets them. We might fail not out of weakness, but out of unconscious obedience to a hidden prohibition against success itself.
And while this seems miles away from Kant's rationalism, we found a surprising echo in his idea of self-conceit. The delusion that we can overcome our finite conflicted nature, which the moral law must strike down, hinting at a similar tension around daring to approach the ideal.
But ultimately, the difference remains crucial. Kant's cannot versus Freud's may not. Limitation versus prohibition.
And the path forward, psychologically, might not be eliminating this contradiction, but learning to live with its ineradicable ambivalence.
Which brings us, as always, to a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. If Freud is right, if our drive towards our highest ideals towards autonomy is fundamentally shadowed not just by the fear of falling short, but by an internal prohibition against succeeding, against becoming the authority.
Then what does this deep-seated ambivalence truly tell us about the nature of freedom? Can psychic freedom ever be a state of pure, unconflicted self-determination? Or is it always, inevitably going to be a kind of ongoing negotiation, a tense truce with the contradictory authorities we carry within us?
Something to ponder. We encourage you to continue your own deep dive into these complex thinkers.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.